Anya Baker. I'm with Issues in Science and Technology, a quarterly journal that's a partnership between Arizona State University and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues along with ASU's CISPO, the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. I am really happy to introduce today's discussion on how to create an academic culture that actually actively counters sexual harassment, preventing it from happening. First, I want to say a little bit about our overarching goals for these events. In part, we're bringing together really interesting people with specialized expertise to reflect on the way that science and society interact in our world. That discussion, it requires not only experts, but lots of other people, aka society. So what that means is that everyone who is here on Zoom is an important part of the conversation. The first half of today's event is going to be a moderated discussion with the panelists. The second half is going to be the panel engaging with your questions that you ask, what you feel is interesting and important. You'll be able to use chat function among yourselves the whole time. To interact with the moderator and the panelists, use the Q&A function. So you can use the chat function, but to reach the moderator, make sure you use the Q&A function. So let's get started. Our moderator is Meredith Wadman. She's a reporter for science, and she has done a lot of work covering sexual harassment in academia. And I'm going to turn it over to Meredith to introduce the panelists. Thank you so much.
Let me try that again. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll hasten on with the mute button now off. I'm going to first introduce Vassiki Chauhan, who is a cognitive neuroscientist at Barnard College, completing a postdoctoral fellowship there. She earned her PhD at Dartmouth College, where she was a plaintiff in a sexual harassment lawsuit and assault lawsuit that led Dartmouth to pay a $14.4 million class action settlement in 2019. Karen Stubaus is Vice President for Academic Affairs at Rutgers University. She has had, do we have Karen with us? Yes, sorry. Okay. She's had extensive experience in university leadership, including dealing with collective bargaining, with faculty conduct and misconduct, with Title IX, with sexual harassment, and expanding faculty diversity. She's also a member of the National Academies Action Collaborative on preventing sexual harassment in higher education. So welcome, Karen. Cheryl Cookie is a women's gender and American Studies professor at Purdue University. She's co-author of a couple books, Serving Equality, Feminism, Media, and Women's Sports, which came out just last year. And in 2018, she co-authored No Slam Dunk, Gender Sports and the Unevenness of Social Change. Cheryl is also a member of the Action Collaborative. So with those introductions taken care of, a first question, a general one for each of you. So sexual harassment was first named and acknowledged as a problem in the 1970s. Now for the 50 years since then, it's been dealt with in the university setting, mainly with Title IX that prohibits sex discrimination at US-funded educational institutions. But this is a legal approach that deals with behavior that has already happened. And today we're here to talk about changing the culture to prevent sexual harassment to begin with. And I'd like to know what that means to each of you in, not a 5-minute disquisition, but something a little shorter from each of you. Vassiki, let me begin with you with that question.
Thanks for the question. I think there is an importance of balancing a preventative approach and dealing with the fact that harm exists. When sexual harassment is as prevalent as it is in academia, it's fair to think of it as a workplace hazard. So we need to come together as a community and deal with it as such and recognize that we need to be there for people who are dealing with this reality in their everyday life. As far as preventative action is concerned, I think cultural change first begins with acknowledging the prevalence of the problem, right? Like acknowledging that this is not something that happens behind closed doors. There are levels to sexual harassment that everyone has encountered in their personal life in one way or the other, whether that is in their own experience or in the experience of someone they truly care about. So for me, prevention is really something that goes hand in hand with acknowledgement, and a culture that fosters the ability to come together in that acknowledgement, to take responsibility, and to support each other in light of an experience that might be painful for some, but not land as traumatic for others, but is traumatic for the people who are reporting that experience, to make space for suffering as it is experienced by people who are targets. And I'll stop there, and I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say about that.
Me too. I'm going to turn to Karen next with this question.
So yes, I agree. Thanks for the question. So I come to this work from the point of view of a long history at Rutgers working in faculty affairs writ large, and helping chairs and deans create the kind of culture that they want to create, actually to encourage academic excellence in their departments and schools. And we all know that the graduate student and postdoc and even undergraduate grapevines and networks are strong, and that students will not be attracted to a department or a center, institute, et cetera, that has a toxic climate. So I have been trying to approach prevention from that point of view, to encourage faculty, chairs, and deans to think about this in the world that they most live in, which is trying to create academic excellence in their units. I am mostly experienced in the issues of graduate students vis-a-vis faculty mentors, faculty major professors, and so forth, who have experienced harassment from their committee members, which is quite damaging. I had a personal, quite a close friend in graduate school who was studying with the single scholar in the field in our university, and got involved in a relationship with him that she could not get out of, and she did what so many women do. They leave the field, they leave academia, they leave science, they just can't deal with it, they don't want to deal with it, they just want it to stop, and they just leave. And that actually is what led the academies to do the study that ended up being published in 2018. I don't want to go on too long, but the focus for me is not sort of Title IX transactional issues, but how to create the culture that we want in our institutions.
Cheryl, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to echo my fellow panelists here. If the focus in institutions is on compliance, once you get to that point, it's already too late. The damage has been done, the harm has been done. And so I think the focus and emphasis on prevention is so critical and central, not only to the mission of an institution or an organization, but the kind of broader mission to scientific discovery. I think, as Karen said, in experience with harassment, we're losing talent, and that talent loss impacts scientific development, scientific progress, and so on. And so the focus on prevention should be one that institutions are invested in. I don't think anyone wants to see something rise to the level that now it's being adjudicated in a Title IX office. And so I think we need to think beyond just the direct impacted parties, to think more broadly as the impacts of sexual harassment extending into departments, into colleges, throughout communities, right? And individuals talk. And so getting ahead of it and changing the culture is so critical, so that when these issues happen, they can be addressed. They can be, you nip it in the bud before it gets to a point where we're losing really talented people and being impacted as a result.
For sure. Okay. Vassiki, you wrote in a recent essay for Issues in Science and Technology that to end harassment, or to end the culture of it rather, survivors and allies should emphasize collective bargaining between unions and employers. And so collective bargaining isn't a term that usually surfaces in sexual harassment discussions. And so would you briefly recap for us your experience at Dartmouth and then how it led you to this conclusion that that's what was needed or is needed?
That's a heavy question. Thanks for asking me that. The experience at Dartmouth was very personal, right? It just happened to be the case that there were 3 professors involved in the lawsuit that I became a plaintiff in, that there were so many people suffering at the time. This is not the norm of the experience that people have. So I was already able to see a global shared nature in how harm propagates in certain communities, in certain scientific communities, which made me really curious about looking beyond my own experience, looking at root causes of cultures where this kind of behavior can perpetuate itself. And I really began to think of sexual harassment not as a very isolated issue. I think discrimination occurs in a lot of different forms, right? I began to think about harassment as a intersectional problem. And above and beyond that, I got really interested in how people express discomfort to powers that be, regardless of where they are in the academic pipeline. So I got really interested in how people get to have the voice that they want to have in forming policy, in negotiating about the culture of the department, in addressing issues, and even like bringing attention to issues. And collective bargaining in that process began to feel more and more like a catch-all manner in which people could come together, brainstorm about what is important to them, and over time, in an iterative fashion, through discussion and deliberation, flesh out ways in which they can participate in creating the institution, in deciding the kind of workplace they want to belong in, not just in the mission statement of the institution, right? But in action, in recognizing that nothing is ever perfect and you need to figure out how to deal with these issues by thinking about solutions yourself, not just punting it off to experts, but participating in what justice looks like and materializing it for everyone around you. So I was just looking for, and this should not be something that is expected of survivors, right? But I was looking for an active way to engage with issues beyond sexual harassment, to deal with the issues of power dynamics, right? To like not need to participate in a civil lawsuit to get an audience with the provost. That was a solution that I was out for. And I realized that even if you end up engaging in certain kinds of adversarial engagements with authorities when you participate in collective bargaining, at least you're in dialogue, at least you're in communication. So I've been thinking about this as a solution for problems that go beyond sexual harassment, but absolutely are inclusive of it. And I could go deeper into what collective bargaining means to me. I don't want to spend too much time deliberating on this, but it's just the power to shape your own workplace, to recognize that we have an opportunity as scientific workers, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows. It's a privilege to be in this discipline, but it's also the work that we do. So the ability to see ourselves as the creators of our own workplace is what I think collective bargaining gives us the power to do.
So, Karen, you've just negotiated at Rutgers a 1-week strike by faculty and postdocs and grad students. How do you see it from the institutional side, what Vassiki is suggesting here?
So I think Vassiki's comments are spot on, and I actually think she's on to something. And let me tell you why. So first of all, you don't negotiate a strike. I mean,
oh, sorry. Well, whatever
sort of happens.
Navigated. Sorry, navigated is the word I should use.
Effective vehicle. So I've been involved in collective bargaining at Rutgers for decades, and the the way I'm thinking about collective bargaining these days is beyond, again, it's sort of beyond transactional in the same way that I said, I wasn't really interested in Title IX transactional issues. So I've been struggling a lot with the issue of how to inoculate higher education institutions from change in top leadership. In other words, the tenure of presidents at our institutions is getting shorter and shorter. And the priorities and focus of different leadership can be very different. So you might have an institutional leadership that is very focused on eradicating sexual harassment and culture change in that venue and so forth. And then there's a new administration and they're interested in something else worthy, but not sexual harassments, right? You might have a president who's very interested in DEI issues and then not. And I've been in higher education long enough, several decades, to see these things come and go, right? So they're in fashion, they're out of fashion. And not in the current round of negotiations, but in the round of negotiations before that. So I negotiate on the management side. I teamed up with someone from the labor side, and we together proposed an article that would embed institutional commitment to diversity and inclusion into the collective bargaining agreement. And also that included a pot of money so that no matter what the institutional leadership of the moment felt about diversity, inclusion, and so forth issues, there would be something in the collective bargaining agreement that would force the institution to pay a certain amount of attention to it, right? And that's been very effective. And I think that's because knowing collective bargaining, as I do in detail, is very hard to get something out of a labor agreement. So when you're negotiating and you don't like the article that you're coming up with, sometimes novices will think, well, we'll get it out of the next agreement. Well, that never happens. It's very difficult to remove something from a collective bargaining agreement. They're usually added on to incrementally, negotiation after negotiation. Mm-hmm. So if we could embed issues regarding social justice, treating survivors appropriately, eradicating institutional betrayal with regard to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct issues into collective bargaining agreements, I think we'd be getting somewhere. And actually some new graduate student union contracts have some of that embedded into the discrimination clauses, where they're actually calling out the institution if they've been unhappy about how the institution's been dealing with sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and taking it one step further outside of the institution's processes to arbitration and mediation as part of the collective bargaining agreement. And so I'm very interested in this because my career has been spent on sexual harassment and collective bargaining. And this is where my worlds happily collide. So I think Vassiki is onto something, and I'm delighted to have more conversation about this with you, Vassiki. I think we ought to take this offline. Thanks.
Great. So I'm going to shift gears a bit and ask Cheryl, you've thought and written a lot about women in sports. And, as I sit in the science realm, I just would be curious to know if you could talk to us briefly about how you ended up on the National Academies Collaborative on Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Ed. Can you connect those dots for me so we can better understand your perspective?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to do that. So I study gender in sport, and specifically some of my research has looked at Title IX and its impacts in terms of expanding opportunities for girls and women. I think those of us, at least in my world, when we hear Title IX, or up until maybe the last decade or so, when we heard Title IX, we instantly thought about women's sports, we thought about athletics. Certainly, I think there was a shift with the 2011 Dear Colleague letter that really kind of folded sexual harassment under sort of the auspices of Title IX. And so some of my work on Title IX then kind of led me to get involved in the Title IX efforts at Purdue. I've sat on the advisory panel where I hear Title IX complaints, and how I got into the National Academies was through the work that I did while chair of the University Senate at Purdue University. And it just so happened that I saw something come across my desk related to the academies and this new initiative on sexual harassment prevention, and thought that this was an issue I wanted to see my institution address in terms of moving beyond compliance to think about prevention. And certainly there were efforts that were happening across campus, but how can we sort of elevate and amplify and enhance and improve those efforts? And so as University Senate Chair, I encouraged Purdue to join the academies. And so kind of bridging those worlds of my University Senate work, my research, as well as the kind of work that I did with respect to Title IX on the compliance side, at least at Purdue. I'm not sure if that addresses your question fully, but that's kind of how I came to be in this space. And I think certainly as a feminist scholar, my commitment is to social justice. My commitment is to ensuring that those who are kind of occupying marginalized or disempowered institutions or disempowered positions in institutions and organizations have a voice, recognizing power dynamics and how those operate. So I think all of that kind of blends together to sort of bring me into this space today.
Okay, I'm gonna piggyback another question onto this then. Because I know your paper with others on the Action Collaborative on procedural justice tackles a lot of issues, but I was hoping you could give us the elevator ride definition of procedural justice, and then talk about representativeness and what that means, and how you saw, or if you have an institution where you think they have come to a solution on at least this piece of procedural justice that's really successful.
Yeah, so and I'm distilling this down. It's procedural justice is a concept that's been used in different academic literature spaces. I think it comes out of business organizational kind of work. And briefly, what procedural justice is just the extent to which people feel that there is fairness in determining an outcome. An outcome can be really broadly defined, and fairness is sort of broadly understood. But within the procedural justice framework, which we talk about in our perspectives paper, the nascent perspectives paper, procedural justice has 7 principles that kind of can inform the degree to which people feel an outcome or arriving at an outcome is fair. You mentioned representativeness or representativeness as one of those principles. And I think what's interesting, and I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation, is I think, Karen, the paper that you wrote for Issues and the work that you're doing at Rutgers really illustrates representativeness in terms of, and I'm going to distill this down kind of into the elevator conversation, right? If you think about all the stakeholders and impacted people coming together and having a seat at the table. So within the procedural justice framework, ensuring representativeness is just about making sure that those who are stakeholders, those who have something to say, those who are a part of a process or procedure or policy, have a sort of a seat at the table, right? And I think representativeness really aligns with voice. And I think, Vassiki, some of that was discussed in your paper as well, or maybe perhaps the lack of representativeness and voice, unfortunately. So voice is like, can we get a seat at the table? But then once we have a seat at the table, are we actually heard? Are our voices heard? Not just that we can say something, but what is it that we say, and how does that get incorporated in terms of informing any kind of procedure, policy, or process that an institution might embark on?
Do you have one, just like the poster child institution for having succeeded in some aspect of this? Something you could point us to be an exemplar?
Yeah, I think within the paper, we do discuss Rutgers University and the efforts at Rutgers. And so I'll kind of throw that back to my panelist, Karen, here to talk a little bit more about that. But specifically in terms of the development of the policy, and I'm butchering this a little bit, so please feel free to correct me, Karen, but incorporating civility and conduct within the promotion and tenure documents, so that faculty aren't solely or simply evaluated based on research, teaching, and service, but there's also a component looking at collegiality, civility, conduct within that policy. And I think that, I was really, when I learned about this effort at Rutgers, was really impressed by that in terms of really holding faculty accountable in ways that really matter, right, for faculty. It's one thing to say, go do this training, go to this workshop, get this certificate. Okay, I check it off the box. But now it's like, okay, now I'm going to hold you accountable to that training. I'm going to hold you accountable to creating a positive climate or a positive culture that enables rather than constrains the work and the productivity of faculty, staff, and students in your department or on your campus. So that's one that I would uphold. I think we talk about some other exemplars in the paper as well, and I would encourage people to check that out. But since we have Karen here, I'd maybe toss it over to her to talk a little bit more about that.
That was going to be my next question for you, Karen. Talk about what you've done at Rutgers with
right. Happy to, and thanks for the opportunity. So I have to give a shout out to the NASM 2018 report on sexual harassment of women. The innovation at Rutgers came directly out of that. One of the recommendations at the end of the document, the 300-page plus document, was about really getting to faculty where they live. And where do they live? They live in reappointment, promotion, tenure, merit increases, that sort of thing. I have to confess that we were just lucky at Rutgers that there existed a document in the moldering in the university policy library for those many decades that had really not been well socialized at the institution, and that had also been endorsed by the AAUP years ago. And we are very unioned up at Rutgers. We have collective bargaining for almost everyone, and certainly we've had it for the tenured and tenure track faculty since 1970. So collective bargaining is a part of our culture. So what we did as a direct result of a committee that worked on implementing some of the recommendations of the 2018 NASM report was we took this policy document, which was called Policy Statement on Professional Ethics, which was what it sounds like, professional ethics for faculty, expectations for how faculty would deal with students, colleagues, research ethics, and so forth. And we incorporated it, we just moved it formally into the formal criteria statements for teaching, research, service, librarianship, performing arts, that sort of thing for all our varied faculty groups, and got that passed by the board because it was already an existing Rutgers document. We just moved it, we incorporated it into the criteria statements, which meant that when faculty groups, when department groups, when the Appointments and Promotions Committee, all the various levels, we have multi-level faculty review process, we're considering faculty, they could in fact consider conduct and professionalism and civility in a way they had not been able to before. So in my work in faculty affairs, I would often be called upon to talk to chairs or deans about someone who was really a very illustrious researcher, but not a great human being, was up for promotion. And I would get a call and say, the teaching is okay, the service is okay, the research is off the charts, but he's a terrible human being. He's a serial harasser. Everybody knows this. Can we consider that when he's coming up for promotion? And I would have to say, no, you cannot, because the criteria statement for promotion and the various criteria for that faculty member do not incorporate anything about professionalism, civility, conduct, anything like that. So this gave us the opportunity to change that and make conduct, professionalism, and so forth part of the criteria statement. I'm not sure it would have happened absent the NASEM report. The 2018 NASEM report was magical in my institution, at least, because everybody knows what the National Academies is. Everybody wants more National Academy members, right? So I'm waving the book around and saying, this book says we should do this, and we should do these other things. And so that was great. And we used that as often as we could. Very interesting. So this was passed in the spring of 2019. Very interesting thing happened 1920 academic year, before spring of 20 fell apart. When my colleague and I, the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, were socializing this new fact that you could consider conduct in promotion, we were doing dog and pony shows throughout the institution. And a couple of things happened. Faculty were sort of drawn up short to realize that this was now possible. And they started talking to each other and to us about ways where they could address conduct before it came to the place where they had someone's promotion dossier on their desk and they wanted to turn them down for promotion because the conduct was bad.
Yeah.
So that led to a new initiative, which is we're loosely calling faculty bystander intervention, but where faculty bodies are starting to, department by department or school by school, develop a more refined statement of shared values or something like that. They can call it whatever they want. So take the 30,000-foot statement on professional ethics that is this university-wide document and bring it down to, okay, so what does this mean in the performing arts? What does this mean for the library faculty? What does this mean in sociology? What does it mean in neuroscience and so forth? So refine it, develop a statement themselves, and then that's a tool for them to intervene with their colleagues, right? So if the Department of Biological Sciences has developed this biological sciences value statement and they see a colleague behaving inappropriately to a postdoc or a graduate student or an undergraduate or each other, they have a tool. They can say, okay, remember we developed this, we all voted on it, it passed, it's part of our department bylaws, whatever. And I'm thinking maybe you're not being 100% in conformity with this. So it gives them a tool. We're in early stages of that. It got interrupted by the pandemic, which so much did. We're getting it back on track. We lost a staff member, we gained a staff member. But I think that's actually going to be a even more effective mechanism to force the conversation and to get to the issues at the microaggression level before they become, a complaint that's been filed and, lots of stuff in a faculty member's personnel file and so forth. What we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, where you want to get to these things early. But, and we have had a case, not exactly sexual harassment, more along the lines of academic bullying, but I think faculty being on notice that that it's possible to be evaluated for their conduct, it's not only research, teaching, and service, is actually also having a preventative impact, right? They're thinking, okay, I really don't want this in my promotion dossier, so I'm going to be a little more careful about what I say and how I behave. So pretty exciting. We don't have a lot of years of road testing it yet, but again, thanks to NASEM and the 2018 report, it gave us the hook to hang this movement of statement on professional ethics into the criteria statements in a formal way.
Wow, well, that is one very specific and encouraging example. I'm going to shift us to questions now, and I'm going to just take the first one for Vassiki. Some states prohibit university employees from engaging in collective bargaining. How might this strategy of incorporating harassment into collective bargaining agreements be adapted for circumstances where collective bargaining isn't allowed? And that's kind of springing on you, because I don't know if you've even had a chance to think about those states or tackle that question. And anyone else who wants to opine on it should also feel free after we hear from Vassiki.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And it's always good to hear about circumstances in which people are thinking about these solutions, but are interrupted in different ways, right? There are movements towards confederations of labor camps within higher education campuses that are underway. There are umbrella unions that support academic workers that are more distributed in their operations. So for scientific workers who don't have their own union on their campus but are interested in starting one and are prohibited by their state laws, the community still exists, right? The community that can be leveraged for expertise, know-how, and preparation still is around. So I would encourage people who are interested in those approaches to look into pre-existing unions in neighboring states or comparable universities. And in the absence of an actual contract, I think there are ways in which people can come together to talk about their day job that doesn't materialize into collective bargaining as it's more widely understood, but serves the same purpose of connecting peers with each other and giving them the platform to make demands. The way in which their demands will be received might not be as effective, but at least they won't be going at the struggle alone. So those are my two cents. I can't really speculate on differences between labor laws within different states of the US, but I like that people are thinking about these solutions even in hostile environments or less than welcoming environments where they find themselves practicing their work in.
All right. Well, I'm going to shift unless others want to chime in to another question or another really more of a...
If I could just add on to that real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the question, whoever asked it, out in the virtual world. So thank you for that. I am in a state, right, where this is not possible to unionize. And so I think one of the ways that we've sort of navigated some of these issues is sort of through shared governance, like those, not we like at my institution, but those of us who are not in states where it's possible to unionize, right? Shared governance or faculty governance are some strategies in some ways that faculty, staff, and students might have a voice vis-a-vis the administration. The challenges that we have with shared governance is the extent to which institutions or organizations are designed such that the input is viewed as advisory and can be incorporated or ignored based on the kind of institutional investments or who's sort of at the in those leadership and decision-making positions. I think, Karen, you talked about how kind of presidents or administrators come and go in different priorities and different emphases. So that's one of the challenges, though, in absence of that sort of formal mechanized unionizing. And I think it is really an important question, an important point, and hopefully we can maybe, NASM can sort of think about ways to sort of take the principles that Vassiki and Karen have been thinking about and implementing and translating those into spaces where the union, the possibility of union doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback, do we have time for me to just piggyback?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
A couple of seconds about this. So I'm a practitioner of collective bargaining for years, but I'm going to talk about a different hat, sort of the scholar hat of collective bargaining in the US. So I am on the board of advisors of something called, wait for it, the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions, which comes out of Hunter College in the CUNY system. And we are looking at issues like this as well. And we track the rise of new bargaining units and have a census of all collective bargaining agreements and that kind of thing. Some of the most interesting new work is being done by the new graduate student unions, the new graduate worker unions and postdoc unions that are questioning, as we've talked before, about how their institutions are dealing with these issues with sexual harassment, misconduct, and other forms of social injustice. And so I think that's very ripe. It's coming into conversation all over the place, and the work is very, very exciting. So I think and again, the collective bargaining space is a space that, as Vassiki pointed out, forces conversation, right? Forces dialogue, forces engagement. And so it's very useful in that sense too. And it is, interfaces with shared governance and faculty governance in interesting ways. So I think I have to thank Vassiki for bringing it up in the first place. I think it's really a very, very active space in which to think about these issues in a way where change can be incorporated into the DNA of the institution, so that it's inoculated against changes in leadership and the vagaries of fashion of what institutions are thinking about. Thank you. Thanks for the time.
Okay, here is something. Much of what is being discussed is still regressive rather than preventative, and it's really about policies and procedures. Is this the best route to culture change? Throwing it open for anyone. Oh, I'll pick on you again, Cheryl. How about? And then we'll go around if the others want to comment.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I might sort of be switching my hats here a little bit to talk about some of my research. But I think I'm not sure if I would necessarily advocate one or the other. I don't think it's an and or approach, but a both and. Certainly, an entity can develop, draft a policy and implement it. But I think what we need is not just an investment in the kind of policy, procedure, kind of practice side of things, but then how do you kind of change culture? How do you change people's perceptions? How do you change the way people think about a particular issue, right? So, going back to my research on sports, right? Title IX certainly increased opportunities for girls and women to participate in sports and athletics. Has it changed the culture, right? In some ways it has, and in other ways it hasn't. So, policy, legislation, procedures, right? That's a piece of a larger puzzle. I think what the National Academies is trying to do is to sort of think about prevention, think about culture change, and doing so in ways that is both evidence-based and attuned to the realities of higher education. And so this is not an easy task. And I think it's probably whoever asked the question, the focus often is on policies, simply because it's easy to write a policy. It's easy to say we have this in place. It's easy to make people attend a training. Changing the culture is what is challenging and difficult. And that takes time and that takes investment. And you can change the hearts and minds of some, others you can't. And so, that's, I think, where the policy is necessary as well.
Karen, can I get you to just sort of talk about, respond how you like if you wanted to add on to Cheryl's answer, but can you also talk about what I just couldn't help noticing in your paper, because it's so relatable, is like the coffee and espresso conversations at Duke University Medical School. It just seemed very like, wow, this really might work. This is getting at something here.
Yeah. So piggybacking onto what I agree with everything Cheryl said, and sort of on a macro level, when we moved the statement of professional ethics into the criteria statements, that was relatively easy. I mean, it seems like a big thing, but that was relatively easy. And then when we went out to socialize it, that's when the hard work started, right? Because I think the policy piece is necessary scaffolding, but it's certainly not sufficient, right? And it's really a house by house search. It's house by house work of talking to people and talking to people who trust you and know you in other venues and everything, and say, okay, this is the policy document. This is why it's important. This is what it's going to mean for your department. This is the tool that it's going to help you, department chair, when you want to have something, a mechanism to ride herd on a faculty member who is not behaving in the way you want. But the coffee conversations, the espresso conversations, I kept waiting for the third level of caffeine in the Duke model, and it wasn't forthcoming. that speaks. So it's really about relationships, right? It's really about someone who can talk to the person who's behaving somewhat inappropriately and say, look, George, I'll make it up. I'm hearing that you may be being misinterpreted in your class, or hearing that your postdocs are feeling this way or that way or something else. And I go back to the other example of don't hug the postdocs, right? So that was actually a faculty friend of mine who thought he was being supportive for decades, and he was hugging postdocs and thinking that they were just like his daughters, and it was great, and he was encouraging them, and they were amongst themselves and with the junior members of the faculty who were women feeling terrible about it and quite violated, and he had no idea. So it fell on me to have what amounted to what today we'd call a coffee conversation with him and say, look, you can't do this. You can't do this. And this is why. And let him search and try his ways and go forth and not do it anymore. And so I think in our academic spaces, particularly in the sciences, it's important to have a colleague who is in the same department or whatever, who you know and trust to say, you need to be behaving differently because this is how it's being perceived. This is how it's being received by those who are hearing you, who are working with you, and then see if they can take that and modify their behavior. Faculty careers are long, right? And social mores change. And so they may be behaving in accordance with social mores that were okay 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, but are not okay now. And you need to give them a chance to search and try their ways and do better. So policies are important, but they're really easy compared to changing thoughts, culture, behavior, and so forth. And that just takes hard work and dedication to the cause, and a conviction that it's so important that our institutions not be toxic cultures for women and marginalized populations.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just add a question for Vassiki that sort of follows on this. But then move to maybe a final thought in a few minutes from all of you with another specific question. But Vassiki, I don't know if you've been observing this closely, but have you noticed anything of what you would call cultural change at Dartmouth as a result of your very high profile class action settlement? Do you feel like there's been meaningful change that gets upstream of complaints and that actually changes culture to prevent it?
So that's an interesting question. I think I'm in a refractory period of recovery from having been, in the midst of things, and cultural change happens at slower timescales, given also the nature of complaints that we were bringing up as a part of the lawsuit. Like, at least that much time needs to pass to see what kind of cultural change has happened. And even though I really take a lot of inspiration from models of institutional courage, ideas about shared governance and things like that, I think preventative policy around sexual harassment can't just operate at the institutional level. I think it can be a little bit wider than that. And examining policy one institute at a time might not be the best way to sort of look at how culture is changing. It can happen at the micro level. It can be at the department or the lab level. It can be at the level of higher education. But an institute is invested in looking as good as possible, right? And it's hard to know how well things that are being adopted as policies are being implemented at the timescales that we are talking about. What I've seen to be encouraging at Dartmouth is that people who've encountered firsthand discrimination have felt more comfortable talking about it. I don't know if they feel more comfortable talking about it to me. That was one of the goals of using my name publicly in the lawsuit, that people would have a resource going forward. But just the fact that you can be an early career researcher encounter an experience that you're not okay with and point it out is pretty powerful. There was a time where that was just absolutely not possible. So I see that as encouraging. And that's why my heart lies very strongly with early career researchers, right? Like there are changes happening at multiple levels, but I believe in the power of peer support and bargaining units and people sort of expressing solidarity with each other, given their ability to relate to each other's experiences. So that camaraderie has been positive for me. Cultural change, I think I've taken a lot of solace from the points that both my co-panelists have made today. Like they've really engaged in this imaginative task of thinking about preventative actions for sexual harassment, but we can't be preventative about an issue at a time, right? Like we want to make science equitable for historically marginalized people, and not all historically marginalized people are practicing science. So we need to take inspiration from our fellows in like the humanities and critical studies who sit comfortably with adopting an attitude of the fact that there is going to be imbalance, that things are not going to be perfect at all times, like carrying cynicism and hope together and critiquing things as they are and continuously imagining what can be. So I think cultural change can only exist in that liminal space, right? Like it can only be examined in that space of constant creation. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also critical of cultural change that I've seen happen at Dartmouth and everywhere else I go in the future.
Right. So, Karen, a last question for you is, toward the bottom of your paper, you write that you're more after decades of working in this area, you actually have some cautious optimism. So why?
Why? So going back to when we were socializing the big policy change, we started out meeting with all the department chairs in arts and sciences on the Newark campus. Rutgers has 3 geographical campuses. And I've been at the university a long time in various positions, and I knew a lot of mostly men, I knew a lot of them. And the reaction I got from them, and I was doing this work with a colleague in the Title IX office, the reaction I got from them was they really wanted the tools to know how to address issues of misconduct among their faculty, that they didn't have the language, they didn't know how to intervene, they didn't know how to have a conversation. And there's something in the faculty culture that is very individualistic. I mean, faculty become faculty because they love their discipline and they want to work in their discipline, at least in my estimation. And they're not joining an organization really, although they end up in organizations that they are very respectful of each other's labs, each other's postdocs, each other's institutes, each other's work. And they sort of needed permission, and again, tools, words, scripts, to is it my business to go to that person and say, really, this is not okay. The way you're treating your graduate students, it's not okay. I'm hearing things, it's not okay. And that's the beginning of my optimism, that if we could just get the right words, the right actions, the right permission for faculty to intervene in each other's space and to not be quite so respectful of each other's space, that things would get better. And so that's what we're engaged in. And then when the Issues in Science and Technology article came out, I actually had a friend from years ago who's a physicist who wrote to me. He saw it, he saw the article, and he saw the piece. And he said, things really are, talked about his department, things really are getting better. The emphasis on professionalism and civility that has taken place in the past few years is changing the culture in his department. And he's very close. He's probably past standard retirement age. And he and I are about the same age. So he's been working in these fields for a long time too. And the fact that he told me, he's a Caucasian male, he told me that most of the leadership in the labs that he works with is now female, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he had many factoids tell me that take heart, things are getting better. Your work is making a difference. And so on that basis, I am cautiously optimistic. I think people do want to do good. They just need a bit of help in how to do it, how to make it happen.
For sure. Cheryl, what's the most important next step that anyone listening here today can do? Oh, and I wanted to preface this in case we run out of time by saying thank you to all the questioners for the excellent questions in the box, and my sincere apology to have gotten to almost none of them. So I really encourage you to keep the conversation going. Cheryl, what are the most important next step or steps that anyone should be taking on?
Thanks. I think that's a tough question to answer, because I think the next step depends on where you're at, what your goals are, what you're empowered to do at your institution or your organization. I think, just sort of starting points. I saw that Kimberly was posting in the chat a number of different resources from NASM. If you haven't read the 2018 report, that's a great starting place. The other different perspective papers and consensus papers that NASM has been putting out related to this issue. I think reaching out to those institutions and colleagues that are doing good work and finding out how they went through that process and what's possible at your institution. The NASM Action Collaborative is a great resource, not only in terms of the reports and the papers that it produces, but also in terms of the networking and connections. And so if your institution is not already a member, I sound like I'm doing a plug here for NASM, so maybe I need to get on their payroll. But if you are not a member of the Action Collaborative, if your institution is not a member of the Action Collaborative, I would look into becoming a member so that you can tap into those networks and the resources. There's different public meetings that NASM puts forward, I think, where anyone can attend regardless of whether or not you are a member. We have a members meeting coming up for those of us that are in June. So I would probably start with maybe those resources, and then the next steps is sort of, I think, depending upon what are the issues and needs at your institution, what are the possibilities, what are the priorities and investments, and what's feasible and possible, and kind of doing that sort of assessment can be really, really helpful for folks who want to make that change.
Vassiki, if you could wave a wand and know that in 5 years, one thing will be universally different or improved, whether it's a process or an attitude or a set of circumstances, what would you do in your all-powerful position to change the culture?
I think anyone who works in the space of sexual harassment will have the resources, experience, and expertise to ensure that the process of hearing someone's report of harm doesn't end up being more traumatizing than what they're relating, because that so often is the case. And I know this doesn't follow the theme of thinking about prevention. I want to so badly exist in that space, but I can't look away from the fact that these are ongoing challenges that we are talking about.
Absolutely.
And I'm really inspired, like you were asking me earlier about what has changed at Dartmouth. Like, I don't follow too much stuff on social media, but I know that there is a union effort with graduate students happening at Dartmouth. It's like a little after my time there, but seeing more initiatives like that, having language about social justice, movements that people are interested in interfacing with higher education, becoming more of a norm, is something that I'm really looking forward to seeing more of in the next 5 years, because higher education workers not only are in a position to bargain for their own good treatment, but we have a responsibility in society, and what we ask for sets a precedent for what is available to others around us. So I think we can really center social justice in the work we do in creating our workplaces. So I want to see more energy around that.
Got it. Manya, do I see you there wanting to leap in? You're muted.
Hi, we're just barely going over. I want to say that this is I had high expectations for this. It exceeded them. And I know that we are over time. So I just want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you, Meredith. Thank you for everybody for joining. We have fantastic questions that we didn't get to. If you like this conversation, you've come to the right place. So you can read more at issues.org. And I think I had longer notes, but I think I just want to repeat the thing that if we can't be preventative one issue at a time. And I think there's a really great discussion of what it takes to be persistent and what it takes to embed mechanisms to prevent sexual harassment. And I just want to thank everybody for this fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks especially to all our panelists.